Imagine you're a prisoner, a thief, a rebel, or simply accused of insulting the Sultan. You're dragged through the streets of Constantinople past jeering crowds, your wrists bound so tightly that blood drips from your fingertips. You're not afraid of death. Death would be a mercy. What terrifies you is what awaits inside the empire's most dreaded cells. Because in the Ottoman Empire, punishment was often worse than dying. From the 15th to the 18th century, the empire built its power on conquest and fear. While the Ottomans were known for their dazzling architecture, strategic genius, and powerful armies, there was a much darker side, a side reserved for those who defied the Sultan's will. Prisoners didn't just face execution, they faced punishments so cruel and inventive that they were designed to break the body, the mind, and the soul. Some were flayed alive in public squares, their skin peeled away in strips, while the executioner's blade stayed just shy of an artery to prolong the suffering. Others were impaled on stakes and left to die slowly over days, their screams echoing across the city as a warning to anyone who dared rebel. Even minor offenses, like insulting a high-ranking official or defying a tax collector, could end in mutilation or branding. Foreign ambassadors and merchants who visited the empire wrote terrified accounts of what they saw. Chains dragging on cobblestones, cages hanging from city gates with rotting corpses inside, and the dreaded executioner's scimitar gleaming in the sun. For the Ottomans, punishment wasn't just justice, it was theater. Each act of brutality sent a message. The Sultan's power was absolute, and mercy was a luxury reserved only for the loyal. In this video, we'll uncover the darkest, most inhuman punishments ever inflicted on prisoners of the Ottoman Empire. We'll reveal not just the physical horrors of the racks, hooks, and molten oil, but also the psychological terror that turned the empire's dungeons into a living nightmare. You'll learn about the punishments reserved for traitors, the grisly fates of captured rebels, and even the terrifying methods used on women and children who dared defy Ottoman rule. What you're about to hear isn't for the faint of heart. History books often skip over these details, but they are a stark reminder of how power was enforced in one of the world's greatest empires. And perhaps most disturbing of all is that these punishments weren't the acts of a single sadistic ruler. They were often part of the law. So, let us step into the shadows of the Ottoman Empire, its most feared prisons, and uncover the chilling truth behind the punishments that turned mere prisoners into examples for all to see. To understand the inhuman punishments of the Ottoman Empire, we need to step back to its earliest days, to the age of Osman and the empire's first sultans. The Ottomans rose from a warrior frontier culture, forged in constant conflict with neighboring kingdoms. Punishment in their eyes was never just about law. It was about maintaining order in a realm that stretched across 3 continents and ruled over dozens of different peoples. Early Ottoman justice drew heavily from a blend of Turkic steppe traditions, Islamic law, and Byzantine practices. From the steppes came the idea that the ruler's authority had to be absolute, and that rebellion against it was not only treason, but sacrilege. From Islamic Sharia, they adopted a code that included amputations, floggings, and stoning. And from the Byzantines, they inherited a taste for public spectacle, executions that were not hidden behind prison walls, but carried out in crowded squares where the message of terror could reach everyone. One of the earliest Ottoman punishments was the bowstring execution. Unlike the axe or the sword, a bowstring didn't shed blood, which, in Islamic tradition, was seen as a cleaner way to execute. A condemned prisoner was forced to kneel, and 2 strong men would pull the cord tight around his neck until his face turned purple and his body went limp. It was quick compared to other methods, yet it became infamous because of who it was often used on: royal rivals. Ottoman sultans used the bowstring to eliminate rebellious governors, treacherous generals, and even their own brothers. A silent night, a silk cord, and the threat of death kept the empire's highest ranks obedient. But for common criminals and rebels, death was rarely so merciful. The Ottomans understood that the key to controlling a vast empire wasn't just punishing wrongdoing, it was making an example of the punished. A thief's hand might be cut off and nailed to a city gate. A corrupt tax collector could be paraded through the streets before being executed. The empire turned its punishments into public theatre, ensuring that fear travelled faster than rebellion ever could. Foreign travellers often described the dread they felt upon entering Ottoman cities. They saw cages hanging from towers, with the decomposing remains of executed bandits, their bodies left as grim warnings. In Istanbul, the famous serpent column of the ancient hippodrome once held the heads of executed rebels, impaled on spikes as carrion birds circled above. These were not random acts of cruelty, but a carefully cultivated language of power, a warning etched into the very architecture of the empire. In the dungeons beneath palaces and fortresses, prisoners awaited their turn with growing horror. The Ottomans didn't just imprison, they broke the spirit first. Accounts from Venetian and French envoys described the damp, airless cells beneath Yedikul fortress, where men chained to walls could hear the muffled cries of others being tortured. Many confessed to crimes they had never committed just to end the waiting. This was the foundation of Ottoman punishment, a system that married religion, tradition, and spectacle. By the 16th century, the age of Suleiman the Magnificent, these practices had grown more elaborate and, in some cases, more sadistic. The Sultan's justice had to be seen as both divine and unchallengeable, and so the punishments became harsher, more inventive, and more terrifying. But how exactly did these punishments evolve into the infamous horrors for which the empire is remembered? The slow deaths, the mutilations, the execution methods that seemed to have been devised purely to maximize suffering. To answer that, we must look at the empire's golden age and its obsession with absolute control. By the height of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, punishment was no longer just a response to crime. It had become a cornerstone of imperial power. The empire was vast, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, and ruling over Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Serbs, Kurds, and many more. Holding such a diverse population together required more than soldiers. It required fear. The Ottomans perfected what they called ibretlik ceza, punishment that serves as an example. One of the most notorious of these exemplary punishments was impalement. Adopted from older Balkan and Eastern European practices, the Ottomans turned it into a symbol of their wrath. Prisoners were stripped naked and forced onto a sharpened stake, sometimes greased to prolong agony, which pierced the body and slowly exited near the shoulder or mouth. The victim was then hoisted upright and left to die over hours, sometimes days, as the stake tore through their insides. Witnesses recorded that entire roads leading into rebellious provinces were lined with impaled bodies, a grim forest of human agony meant to crush the spirit of resistance. Equally dreaded was the punishment of the hooks. In coastal cities like Salonika and Smyrna, condemned pirates or rebels were hoisted by iron hooks that pierced their ribs or back muscles. Suspended like butchered carcasses, they were left to die in the open air, their corpses feeding gulls and crows. European sailors wrote in horror of seeing the harbors of the Ottoman Empire lined with these ghastly displays. But perhaps no punishment embodied the empire's philosophy of calculated terror more than the wheel-breaking of traitors. While less common than impalement, it was reserved for particularly despised enemies of the state, rebel leaders, mutinous Janissary officers, or assassins of the Sultan's favorites. The condemned was tied to a heavy cartwheel while their limbs were methodically shattered with iron rods. Sometimes the broken bodies were left displayed on city walls for days, so that every passerby could see the mangled warning. What made these punishments especially terrifying was their public nature. Ottoman authorities often staged them in major squares. In Istanbul, the hippodrome was a favored venue, and sometimes even summoned local dignitaries to witness the execution. The spectacle was designed not only to punish, but to remind all classes, from commoners to provincial governors, of the Sultan's unchallengeable authority. Fear, the Ottomans believed, was the glue that kept an empire from fracturing. Religion played its part as well. While Islamic law set limits, favoring relatively swift punishments like beheading or stoning, the sultans and their viziers justified harsher methods as tools of state necessity. A rebellious province wasn't just committing treason, it was defying the order of God's appointed ruler. To break that defiance required more than a sword. It required something unforgettable. Travelers and diplomats from Europe often returned home haunted by what they had witnessed. Venetian envoys described marketplaces where severed heads were piled like grotesque trophies. A French merchant wrote of seeing dozens of impaled bodies swaying outside Belgrade after a failed uprising. These accounts spread across Europe, fueling both fear of and fascination with the empire's cruel justice. By this period, the Ottomans had turned punishment into a tool of psychological warfare. It was not enough to kill a rebel. The death had to linger in the memory of the living. And as the empire grew richer and more centralized, the methods of execution grew ever more elaborate, sometimes even theatrical, a grim performance intended to remind all who watched that the Sultan's reach extended from the palace in Istanbul to the furthest frontier. But the empire's cruelty was not reserved for rebels alone. Within the palace walls, in the labyrinth of intrigue and suspicion that surrounded the Sultan, punishments were carried out in secret, and were often even more inventive and horrifying. While the public squares of the empire displayed agony to terrify the masses, the heart of Ottoman cruelty lay behind the high walls of the Topkapı Palace. Here, in the shadow of the Sultan's chambers and the harem, power struggles were decided not in grand trials, but in the quiet hours of the night, with punishments that were as ingenious as they were merciless. The most infamous instrument of palace execution was the silken bowstring. In accordance with a grim custom, members of the Ottoman dynasty, brothers, cousins, and sometimes even sons of the reigning sultan, were considered potential rivals. To shed their blood was seen as sacrilegious. To strangle them, however, was deemed lawful. The executioners, usually deaf-mute palace servants called cellards, would enter the condemned prince's chamber at night, carrying a silken cord. No words were exchanged. The prince's final moments were a silent struggle, as the bowstring tightened around his throat, snuffing out his life without spilling a drop of blood. This method was also used on high-ranking officials who fell out of favor, grand viziers, admirals, provincial governors. Sometimes the sultan would send them a symbolic gift, a bowstring wrapped in silk. Receiving it was a death sentence. The condemned man was expected to submit without protest. Refusal or resistance only made his end slower and more violent. Not all punishments in the palace were so swift. The Ottomans devised subtler forms of torment for political prisoners or disgraced members of the royal household. One such method was blinding, often inflicted on princes who posed a threat to the throne. Blinded heirs could not claim the sultanate, and thus were left alive, but forever removed from power. Chroniclers describe red-hot irons used to sear the eyes, leaving the victims disfigured and helpless, a living warning to others. Another fate whispered about in the harem was slow starvation. Disgraced concubines or eunuchs who knew too many palace secrets were sometimes confined in dark, airless chambers with nothing but a jar of water and a few scraps of bread, enough to prolong their suffering but not sustain them. These deaths were hidden from public view, yet their stories leaked through the walls and spread among servants and courtiers, cultivating a climate of constant dread. Even execution could be turned into a spectacle within the palace. When the Janissary corps rebelled, as they did several times in the empire's history, captured ringleaders were often dragged into the courtyard of the palace and hanged on the gates. Some were impaled and displayed outside the walls for the people of Istanbul to see. The palace itself became both courtroom and gallows, a reminder that the Sultan's justice spared neither soldier nor noble. Religious scholars, ulama, occasionally protested the severity of such punishments, citing Islamic injunctions for mercy and due process. Yet the sultans and their viziers argued that these punishments were necessary to maintain the empire's order. They claimed that the survival of millions sometimes required the ruthless elimination of a few. The palace punishments reveal a chilling truth about Ottoman rule. Its greatest terrors were often invisible to the public. People in distant provinces saw only the aftermath, a disgraced vizier's head displayed on a pike in the capital, or the rumor that a sultan had strangled his own brothers to secure his throne. The secrecy gave these punishments an almost supernatural aura, as if the sultan's anger could reach anyone, anywhere, in silence. The cruelty within the palace was mirrored by the empire's treatment of prisoners of war, and rebellious populations on the frontiers. Those unlucky enough to be captured in Ottoman campaigns often met fate so grim they rivaled even the palace's dark legends. Beyond the palace walls, where the Ottoman armies clashed with rival empires and rebellious vassals, punishment was not only a tool of justice, but a weapon of terror. Conquered cities, insurgent tribes, and captured soldiers often faced horrors that blurred the line between retribution and calculated psychological warfare. One of the most feared punishments on the frontier was impalement. This gruesome method, often carried out in full view of local populations, involved driving a sharpened wooden stake through the victim's lower body, sometimes through the anus, sometimes the abdomen, and erecting the stake upright so the victim's weight dragged them downward. Death could take hours, even days, as the stake tore slowly through the body. Ottoman chroniclers recorded instances where entire roads leading to rebellious towns were lined with the impaled bodies of insurgents, their corpses swaying like grisly banners to warn others of the price of defiance. Another terrifying fate was flaying alive. Though less common, it was reserved for captured rebel leaders or enemy spies. The victim's skin was carefully peeled from the flesh while they still lived, often in front of assembled crowds. This act of public punishment was intended to strip away not only the flesh, but also the dignity and authority of those who dared to oppose the Sultan's rule. Captured soldiers and rebellious peasants often faced mass executions. When an enemy fortress resisted too long, or a region rose in revolt, the Ottoman military sometimes responded with collective punishment. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men were executed in a single day, their heads piled into macabre pyramids outside the city gates. These displays served as both revenge and a signal to other communities that resistance would be met with overwhelming and merciless force. A particularly infamous practice, especially in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, was the devshirme, or blood tax. Though technically a system of conscription rather than punishment, it felt like collective retribution to the Christian families it targeted. Boys as young as 8 were taken from their homes, converted to Islam, and trained as Janissaries, elite soldiers of the empire. Families who resisted sometimes saw their villages raided, elders executed, and property seized as a warning to others. Even prisoners spared immediate death could face fates scarcely less grim. Those captured in battle were often sold into slavery, forced to row in Ottoman galleys until they died of exhaustion or disease. Some were blinded and sent back to their homelands as living messages of Ottoman power. Others were mutilated, ears, noses, or even hands cut off, to mark them forever as defeated enemies. Religious leaders in Europe and the Middle East alike denounced these punishments as barbaric. Yet in the logic of the time, they were seen as essential instruments of control over a vast, diverse empire. To the Ottomans, harsh punishments were not random cruelty, but a language of fear, one that spoke louder than treaties or proclamations. For the countless victims on the empire's borders, however, this language brought only despair. The memory of impaled rebels and massacred towns lingered for generations, shaping how the Ottoman name was remembered in regions from Hungary to Arabia. If the battlefield and public square were the empire's stages of terror, the Ottoman prisons and dungeons were its hidden chambers of slow, methodical torment. Far from the eyes of the public, these places devoured the will of prisoners long before death ever claimed them. Many Ottoman cities maintained a zindan, a type of subterranean dungeon often carved into old fortresses or beneath administrative buildings. These cells were cramped stone pits, windowless and damp, where prisoners were chained directly to the walls or floors. The air was thick with the smell of mold, sweat, and rot. Light rarely pierced the gloom except when the guards brought food, often no more than scraps of bread and water. Physical torment was routine. Beatings with iron-tipped whips or heavy wooden rods greeted prisoners on their first day. Some were suspended by their wrists for hours or even days, a punishment known as falaka when combined with repeated blows to the soles of the feet. The falaka was particularly notorious. Its pain was excruciating but rarely fatal, allowing interrogators to repeat it endlessly. Prisoners often emerged crippled, unable to walk, yet were given no respite from further labor or torment. For those accused of treason, rebellion, or blasphemy, there were even darker fates. Accounts from European captives describe the use of iron collars and shackles so heavy that the victim's skin festered beneath them. In some cases, prisoners were chained in coffins or small wooden boxes, where they could neither stand nor lie down fully, condemned to days of agonizing cramps and sleeplessness. Ottoman captors also used psychological torture. Prisoners were often kept in total darkness for weeks, hearing only the moans of other captives or the scraping of rats in the corners. Guards taunted them with false promises of release, only to drag them back for renewed beatings or interrogations. Public floggings within the prison courtyards reminded inmates that escape or rebellion was unthinkable. Disease thrived in the zindans. Overcrowding, filth, and poor ventilation turned them into breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Prisoners often wasted away slowly, their deaths unrecorded except as a tally in a guard's ledger. Some captives even preferred execution over prolonged confinement, pleading for a quick death rather than enduring the endless cycle of beatings, hunger, and sickness. Foreign envoys, merchants, and missionaries occasionally reported these conditions back to Europe, and their accounts horrified audiences who imagined the Ottoman Empire as a land of splendid palaces and silken luxury. The grim truth was that beneath the grandeur of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace and the mighty domes of its mosques, countless prisoners languished in dark, airless holes, forgotten by all but their tormentors. For the empire's rulers, however, such cruelty served a purpose. Prisons were not merely places to hold criminals, they were machines of fear, designed to crush the body and spirit alike, ensuring obedience even among those far beyond the dungeon walls. The echoes of those suffering in the zindans became part of the unspoken language of Ottoman authority. If the prisons of the Ottoman Empire crushed the spirit in secret, its public executions shattered it, in full view of the world. The sultans and their viziers understood that nothing maintained order like a well-staged death, especially when that death was as spectacular and terrifying as it was final. In Istanbul, the Meydan, the Hippodrome, and the square of the Janissaries were more than just public spaces. They were the empire's theaters of fear. Here, criminals, rebels, and even high-born officials met their end before crowds summoned to witness the spectacle. The executions were often as political as they were punitive, a way to demonstrate that the Sultan's justice spared no one, not even his closest advisors. The most infamous method was the bowstring strangulation, for Ottoman elites such as viziers, pashas, and even royal princes accused of treachery. Executioners would arrive at their homes in the dead of night, carrying a silken cord. No blade, no blood, only the tightening of the cord around the neck, quick and silent. It was said to be merciful compared to what awaited lesser men. For rebels and common criminals, mercy was rarely an option. Many were impaled, raised on tall stakes for hours or even days as they writhed in agony, while the crowd looked on. The Ottomans did not invent impalement, but they perfected it as a tool of fear, using it especially in the Balkans to punish insurgents and intimidate subject populations. Other victims were quartered alive, tied to 4 horses and torn limb from limb, or beheaded en masse after failed uprisings. The heads of rebels were sometimes displayed on the city gates, or piled in pyramids on the battlefield, a grim warning to all who passed by. Captured enemy commanders often suffered hanging on iron hooks, sometimes through the ribs, left to die slowly over the course of hours. Even the mighty Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Sultan, were not immune. When they rebelled or fell out of favor, they were executed by the thousands. Some strangled, others drowned in the Bosphorus, their bodies washing ashore as silent reminders of the price of disobedience. Foreign ambassadors recorded these scenes with horror and fascination, writing of the calculated pageantry of Ottoman executions. There was no attempt to hide the violence, it was part of the message. The empire wanted its subjects to know that defiance would end not just in death, but in humiliation and spectacle. For centuries, this brutal choreography of punishment held the vast Ottoman territories in check. A single execution could ripple through distant provinces, quelling dissent before it ever surfaced. The empire's rulers understood that terror could be more enduring than the sword. The Ottoman Empire's punishments were not just about death, they were about control, a relentless, calculated campaign to keep a vast, diverse empire obedient. The prisons, the chains, the bowstrings, the impalement stakes, they were all pieces of a system designed to remind every subject that the Sultan's reach was absolute, and that defiance would end in suffering too horrific to imagine. For centuries, the whispers of these punishments traveled further than the armies themselves. A merchant in Cairo or a farmer in the Balkans might never have seen an impalement stake or a bowstring execution, but they knew what it meant to cross the empire. The stories alone, of rebels hoisted on spikes, of prisoners blinded before the court, of Janissaries drowned by the thousands, became as powerful a deterrent as the punishments themselves. Historians describe the Ottoman approach as a form of psychological rule by spectacle. Where Western powers often hid executions within prison walls, the Ottomans brought them to the streets, made them public, and transformed them into tools of governance. The spectacle didn't just punish the guilty, it warned the watching masses. And that warning worked. Provinces that simmered with unrest would quiet down after just one grisly display. Even centuries later, the legacy of that fear lingers. In the Balkans, in the Middle East, and in parts of North Africa once under Ottoman rule, folk tales still recount the horrors of impalement and the dreaded knock at night, the silent arrival of the bowstring executioners. These stories became part of cultural memory, passed from generation to generation, like dark cautionary tales. But there's another side to this history, one that reveals the cost. The empire's reliance on violence and spectacle as tools of control bred resentment and rebellion that never truly died. The fear that once held the provinces together eventually fueled uprisings that shattered the empire's grip. It was as if the terror that had once sustained the Ottomans sowed the seeds of their decline. Today, it's tempting to view these punishments as relics of a distant, barbaric past. But they remind us of an enduring truth. Power often maintains itself not just with armies or laws, but with the stories of what happens to those who dare to resist. The Ottomans understood that better than most, and it's that understanding, the blending of punishment and performance, pain and propaganda, that makes their legacy as haunting as it is unforgettable. In the end, the Ottoman Empire's punishments did more than discipline criminals or crush rebellion. They created a culture of dread so deep that even centuries after the last bowstring tightened and the last impalement stake rotted away, the echo of that fear still lingers in the pages of history.